The novel I'm writing at the moment is about some left-wing anti-Hitler activists, writers and journalists who had to leave Germany as soon as Hitler came to power in January 1933. In their view, their nation had been hijacked by a neocon barbarian. One of my characters, the playwright and revolutionary Ernst Toller, spoke at the International Pen Congress in Dubrovnik in May 1933, 2 weeks after his works had gone up in flames in the book burnings. I say parenthetically, he attended as part of the British delegation under H.G. Wells because the German pen had already been cleansed of left-wing writers and substituted with Nazi writers. In his address, Toller found the words to describe to the international community what they were fighting for in exile. He called it the other Germany. This other Germany was the Germany of Luther and Goethe and Marx, and of ordinary decent Germans who did not want nor deserve a warmongering right-wing thug. Toller wanted to incite his people to courage. This meant facing down fear. He said, "Fear is the psychological foundation of dictatorship. The dictator knows only that the man who has overcome fear lives beyond his power and is his sole dangerous enemy." He had some quite high-flown language. He's a playwright. At the time of Toller's speech, the idea of the other Germany was already disappearing. The people who held it were being squeezed into concentration camps or killed in their homes. The speed of the iron filing manoeuvre, the speed with which the National Socialists centralised power to themselves, eviscerating the power of the states, ridiculing intellectuals, controlling universities, publishers, newspapers, the professions, pen, and with a struggle, the churches and the military, is astonishing, even now. The government made cowards of everyone, almost. Civil society fell in a matter of months. I like to imagine things physically. If I close my eyes and see Professor Mushroom's hairy chest or Frau Paul's sorry handkerchief, I'm back on the park bench in Berlin or on the vinyl couch. Stories of physical acts, scaling a wall, a kiss, a back turned, have the most powerful metaphoric value to explain the world. The story of the Crow Indians has helped me find a way to think about courage in the face of death. It's helped me understand how courage is connected to the defence of one's culture. And it's helped me understand how both conscience and reason may be developed from and connected to society and the well-being of each other. The Crow were a nomadic people in the western US who survived by hunting buffalo. Their culture was intimately linked with their survival in practical, visible ways. Each time they moved to fresh hunting grounds, they had to define the scope of that territory and defend it from other tribes. Their last great leader was a man called Plenty Coups. His name was an honour bestowed for his courage for pulling off the coups crucial to his people, which are as follows. In a confrontation with their enemy, the Sioux, a Crow warrior would carry his coup stick into battle and plant it in the ground. It marked the delimitation of Crow territory, and it signalled the point the Crow warrior would defend to the death. The philosopher Jonathan Lear, in his book Radical Hope, writes, "This was a paradigm of courage. These were men who were evidently willing to risk their own lives to protect the tribe." He goes on, "In planting the coup stick, the Crow warrior was also in effect saying, 'There is a fate worse than death. Namely, it is better for me to die than for the Crow tribe to be threatened by the penetration of the boundary at this point.'" This struck me like a bolt. Plenty Coups planted his stake for reasons that might be described as personal and ones that might be called cultural or political, related to the group. He did it because his sense of himself as a decent human being depended on it, and because the survival of his group depended on it. Anna Politkovskaya and Frau Paul and Ernst Toller say, no, that is going too far. They say, I will not betray, or I will not be silent, for personal reasons, and for reasons which have to do with the survival of the group. If they betrayed or were silent, they'd no longer be recognisable to themselves as moral beings. That's the personal reason. The group reason is this. They're showing that there is a point beyond which the exercise of power is illegitimate. There's a point at which it threatens human dignity and decency, and therefore their group, which relies on this decency and dignity to exist. This is Anna planting her stake in protest at Putin's iron filing manoeuvre. She asks, "Why do I so dislike Putin? I dislike him because he does not like people. He despises us. He sees us as a means to his ends, as a means for the achievement and retention of personal power, no more than that." She's doing it because dictatorships are bad for the survival of the group. She writes, "In Russia, we've had leaders with this outlook before. It led to tragedy, to bloodshed on a vast scale, to civil wars. Because I want no more of that, I dislike this typical Soviet Chekist as he struts down the red carpet in the Kremlin on his way to the throne of Russia." And this is the group Anna is doing it for, now and in the future. It is the metaphorical stake. She writes, "We cannot just sit back and watch a political winter close in on Russia for several more decades. We want to go on living in freedom. We want our children to be free and our grandchildren to be born free." How does a person know where to plant the stake? Where does this gut feeling of good and bad come from? My mother died not so long before my first daughter was born, so my godmother took a particularly loving interest in us. "I promised your mother on her deathbed," she told me, "I'd look after you when you had a baby." Though my mother may have made some kind of request and my godmother some kind of promise on that deathbed, my mother would never have expressed herself so dramatically. She was a stoic with an almost pathological distaste of sentimentality. My mother was a social scientist who proved things with large demographic studies and statistics. My father was a medical scientist. In our house, if you had an emotion, you were best off if you could justify it with an empirical, international, statistically sound study published in a peer-reviewed journal. In our house, reason was king. My godmother is a different type, no less stoic, but emotionally direct, black Irish, and full of compassionate tales of the most outrageous woe generally occurring to members of her immediate family. So when my daughter was born, my godmother looked at her and said, "Wouldn't you just run under a train for her?" Thank you. Even with the remnants of my mind, I thought that was a bit extreme. I was having trouble sitting, let alone running. Thank you. I was also having trouble imagining a situation so either-or as me or the baby. We were not so separate, she and me. I was also in a state, there's no other word for it, of bliss. It's not that one is fulfilled by having a baby. It's more the relief of being put outside yourself. You are no longer the main character in the play of your life. You're more connected to the generations before and to come in your own family and to the breeders all around you now in society. Your welfare is dependent on theirs. You can relax into the rest of the universe and take a supporting role. You are yourself, deflected. As time has gone on and my two daughters have taught me what it means to be linked in a chain of evolution, past and present, and a chain of my community now, I understand that I would be under that train. I understand it viscerally, emotionally. But in deference to my scientific upbringing, I turn to some internationally published longitudinal peer-reviewed studies of the origins of human morality to see how this might work. It's commonly believed that good behaviour can only be learned behaviour, that we're socialised to control with reason our darker, more animal natures. Left to our true ones, we would be as selfish as the selfish gene dictates. The inner human would be let loose, something amoral and out of control. This kind of thinking is pervasive in Western culture. It's in Freud's metaphor for the human psyche, according to which a socialized superego keeps in check the base hungers of the id. It's in Hobbes' social contract theory, in which free and equal and self-serving individuals cede a measure of their independence in return for protection in society. In the Judeo-Christian tradition, the idea is as old as original sin. The eminent primatologist Frans de Waal calls this veneer theory, the idea that morality is only a thin veneer over an amoral or immoral core. Or, put another Hobbesian way, homo homini lupus, man is wolf to man. De Waal sees major problems with veneer theory because, as he writes, free and equal people never existed. Humans started out, if a starting point is discernible at all, as interdependent, bonded and unequal. We come from a long lineage of hierarchical animals for which life in groups is not an option, but a survival strategy. Human beings cannot thrive outside of groups, so morality, altruism, sharing and an intolerance of injustice have developed to enable the survival of the group. Moral reasoning develops from an understanding of the needs and emotions of the other people in the group. De Waal writes that human morality is firmly anchored in the social emotions with empathy at its core. This is a recent and radical thought. It undoes the traditional Western dichotomy between the emotions and reason by placing moral reasoning as a product of the well-functioning of the emotional reactions to others. It firmly removes reason as a superego superimposed on an animal core. De Waal writes, natural selection has provided us with the psychological makeup, tendencies and abilities to develop a compass for life's choices that takes the interests of the entire community into account, which is the essence of human morality. When Anna is speaking out, or Frau Paul or Ernst Toller, they're responding to the essence of human morality, which takes the interests of the entire community into account. They have a sense of the other Russia or the other Germany, which, however abstract or imprecise, correlates more closely with the interests of the entire community than the dictatorship they face, and they have the courage to do it. If this is our common good nature, what is it that bends it out of shape? It is fear. First, there's the innate fear of the conservative person. In an extraordinary study of the psychological characteristics of right-wing thinkers, Professor John T. Jost and colleagues found that there were two main characteristics shared by conservatives: a resistance to change and a tolerance of social inequality. Conservatives hold that it's a dog-eat-dog world, and they want to be the ones doing the eating. The characteristic that motivates conservatives most is fear. They're frightened of change and frightened of moves towards social equality that would erode their positions. It doesn't seem apparent to them that in a dog-eat-dog world, one dog ends up dead, the other watching, alone, frightened of the next attack. Or one dog ends up in a gated condo community with private police protection, afraid of the poverty outside the gates that their choices have created. The fastest way to a Hobbesian world, where life is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish and short, is to behave as if this were naturally so. Secondly, fear in people can be created. It can be created by government to consolidate its power. This can be done by starting a war against an external enemy or finding an internal one, like Jews or refugees. It might happen by blaming communist terrorist cells for burning down the Reichstag, as Hitler did, or by bombing apartment buildings in Moscow and blaming the Chechens, as Putin did. Or it might be done by implying refugees reaching Australia are terrorists, cleverly disguised as women and children and men fleeing terror. Then, failing an actual attack or manufactured event, a government might, like the Howard government, find someone else's war to go to, and in doing so bring down a threat on your own people from which you can protect them with laws that curtail their civil rights. Australia went to war with George W. Bush's United States like a runt child, running after the big kids, wanting to be part of their game, whatever it turned out to be. When asked at the Sydney Writers' Festival, do Russians have the government they deserve? Anna said, I do agree. She put a hand on her heart. But I do believe in my people. This is the quandary. We need to believe in our better natures in order to find the courage to defend them. We need to remember what happened under the Howard government so that next time we might face down our fears, both innate and manufactured. Without courage, as Aristotle had it, there is no other virtue. Writers have no more conscience than anybody else, but we have a particular relationship with words. The Howard government called people who are fully within their legal rights to claim asylum illegals, hoping to taint them with a criminality that would make us fear them. Orwell had it that spin covers the truth like a layer of snow, like an octopus squirting ink. But in my view, it's also that words are our tools. When racist mass murder is called ethnic cleansing, or civilian deaths in war are collateral damage, or people legitimately seeking asylum are illegals, it is my tools that have been stolen and blunted. A writer's job is to use the sharpest words to say, the emperor has no clothes, or, as Anna had it, we are ground to dust between the millstones of terror and anti-terror. You don't have to be the writer to speak the truth, to be a writer, to speak the truth as you see it, but you can't be a good writer without doing so. It's not, for the most part, the bankers or bakers or painters who are locked up first in China or Russia or the Third Reich. It is the writers who, relying on empathy, reason, and very sharp tools, plant the stake first. In the last weeks she had, my mother made 3 exquisite photo albums, one for each of her children. Being unsentimental, until this moment she'd kept all the childhood photographs stuffed into an old cardboard pipette box from Dad's lab. Mum sat at the kitchen table in her turban and put in photographs of her ancestors, of herself, and of our family, each of us, from childhood to grown. She left the last pages blank for us to put into them our own children, whom she would not know. In the end, for her, a woman with a fine and serious mind, a woman of reason, of longitudinal demographic studies and impeccable statistical analyses, it came down to this: a chain of evolution and emotion from before, through us, and on. As soon as his mother didn't answer the phone, Ilya Politkovsky knew she was dead. When he reached her building, the emergency services were already there. Anna had been killed when the lift doors opened, shot twice in the upper body, and then in a signature of a Russian contract killing, the so-called control shot was fired into her head. The murder occurred on Vladimir Putin's birthday. He said nothing about it for 3 days. When he did speak, it was as if from the standard manual of totalitarian slights. He said, "She was well known in the media community, in human rights circles, and in the West, but her influence on political life within Russia was very minimal." In other words, she was not important. I suppose rather than a potshot at the recently dead, this was intended as self-exculpation. She was not important enough for me to have her killed. If Anna was right, and power is so centralized in Russia that nothing happens there without the implicit or explicit approval of the Kremlin, this would include her murder. The baseball cap gunman in the CCTV footage has not been apprehended. The trial of some men involved in the murder is taking place now, in closed court, in Moscow. No one expects the person or persons who ordered the killing to be brought to justice. In an interview after Anna's death, Vera said, "I'm happy that the person who did all those things was my mother. Because to pass on a model to your kids, you have to set an example. A model of how to live while preserving your integrity, and in my opinion, that was one of her greatest achievements." I think Vera understood that it was not about Anna and it was not even about her own children. It was about a personal stake and about the dignity and survival of all Russians. This is the thing with children. This is what one hopes for, a shared understanding that it is not about us, it's about all of us. We do not want anyone under that train. We want to be on it. Here is the poet Sharon Olds on her daughter going off to college, wearing an animal print dress. And then she was on the train, in her dress like a zodiac, her body covered with the animals that carried us inside their bodies for 1,000 centuries of sex and death, until flesh knew itself and spoke. Let's know ourselves, be brave and speak. Thank you.